Hey everyone, welcome to Drive Thru Review 692. Today we're going to take a look at Undaunted North Africa. Now this is the follow-up to Undaunted Normandy, which came out last year. And it's not an expansion, you don't mix the components at all, although there will be some kind of expansion coming out, I believe, early next year that will add new stuff to this game as well as Normandy, as well as be able to kind of mix them around a little bit. Maybe we'll see. So what this is the Italian army and the British army kind of going head to head in the theater of North Africa. And it plays 90, maybe 80, 90% just like Undaunted Normandy, but with a lot of new additions, probably most notably being the addition of vehicles. And you can see one of these vehicles depicted here on the cover. This is one of the patrol trucks for the British Army. Now, just like the original game, it comes with two books, a rule book and a scenario book, both very well written and presented. Here you can see an example of the 11th scenario. There are 11 scenarios in this particular edition, and it's very easy to break down and digest which cards you should be including, or which counters you should be including, and so on, and how to lay out the map. Also, one nice feature of this is there is a player aid in the back of each book, so you can give one to each player that's even themed into different armies. And the game is very succinct and elegant in a lot of ways, and basically all you really need is somebody to kind of know the game, and then you can easily explain all of these special keywords. It's not too bad to introduce new players to this game and tell your opponent what all the various actions you can do with the various cards are. Now, if you're not familiar with the Undaunted series, it's a deck building kind of skirmish warfare game. So you're playing cards on your turn, activating the cards for one of the possible actions that they can do, and then those cards also act as a sort of hit points or morale in some cases. Now, one thing that this rule book does have in it is at the very beginning, there's a little nice blurb that says, if you've played Undaunted Normandy, here's a couple of key points. And this is a vital reading if you've played the original, because there are some very key differences to the game. Not only have they added vehicles to the game, but the way that you want to kind of approach the game strategically and thematically in a lot of ways is different. And one of the probably the most different aspect to me, which I'll talk more about at the review, is how, what happens, I should say, when you take damage and you start to remove cards for some of the various counters on the board. That's a very, very different kind of approach here. So we'll get to a little bit of a rules overview now, and then I'll explain that little detail, and then we'll jump into the review. But if you're familiar with Undaunted Normandy, you know, like I said, 80-90% the same. Now, if you're not familiar with the Undaunted series and how to set up the maps, it's very easy. The scenario book tells you you've got these little double-sided square tiles. You set them off just kind of off-center so that it's easy to tell what, you know, spaces you can move to and from with the various different counters. You've got special locations on the board that you might mark with objective tokens, little counters to indicate your troops, as well as, in this case, vehicles. And also some key objective points and structures in the case of this game that players will either be trying to control or even perhaps demolish and destroy, as well as other little terrain features. Now, this is going to vary from scenario to scenario. And one of the differences between Undaunted Normandy in this game is how they kind of roll out the scenarios. And I'd say in this game there's probably 2 intro scenarios, maybe 3 if you're kind of splitting hairs, whereas the last 8 are really varied and interesting tactically and thematically and sort of objectively. Whereas in the original Undaunted Normandy, it really kind of slow rolled the introduction of new units a little bit slower. So it wasn't until you got about, you know, kind of midway towards the end of the scenarios that you were really kind of using the kitchen sink in terms of all of the tools in the toolboxes. With this, though, it gets you going a little bit quicker. I think it probably kind of expects that most players have played the original or are familiar with it, so you don't need that much of an introduction. But you get the kind of the benefit of doing it this way, because then you have real asymmetry in this one. Now, in the original, there was some asymmetry based on the scenario. You know, like maybe you'd be trying to capture the objectives, I'd be trying to defend them, or I'm trying to escape my troops off at this end of the map, and you're trying to prevent that. So there was asymmetry there. But they really kind of lean into that with this in terms of the different vehicles that each side has and the different types of objectives and everything. So you get going a little bit more quickly with this in terms of the scenario setup and so on. And speaking of asymmetry, the two sides have very, very different card makeups. So the Italian side has tanks and tank drivers and tank commanders and so on. And each scenario will tell you which cards to put into your deck and which ones will be available to kind of like purchase or recruit later on. And here we have a look at the British Army. They don't have any tanks, they got some trucks. They do have more kind of saboteurs and demolitionists and those kinds of cards as well. Now the way that a vehicle actually works is you can see this medium tank has 3 slots. So if a counter is on the same space as the tank counter, then they can enter and exit the vehicle when you activate that counter. But if the counter, in this case the driver, is in one of these slots, then they also get, in addition to the actions available on their cards, the actions that you can see underneath here. So in this case the driver can drive the tank or move the tank around, or it can control an objective point. And some of these vehicle slots can be inhabited by anybody, but in some cases you'll see the icon in the middle there, in this case a steering wheel, has to be occupied by somebody that has that skill. In this case the tank driver also has that little icon. So you can see that they legally and skillfully know how to drive a tank, whereas the average soldier maybe doesn't know how to do that. Now, in addition to these troop differences, the Italian Army also has a recon aircraft card in some scenarios that they can play, and it kind of does like a little strafing run of shooting at soldiers and stuff. It kind of breaks some of the rules in terms of the terrain and the distance of combat and things like that. So some of the scenarios will add that sort of harassing card of kind of overhead gunfire to the mix, which kind of mixes things up just even a little bit more. But let's talk about the last key difference here between North Africa and Normandy, and then I'll get kind of into the review. And that's how combat, and more specifically damage, actually works in this edition. So just kind of a quick refresher on combat if you've not played an Undaunted game. Here we have, let's say, this gunner here who's in the 12B area, and he's going to go ahead and take a shot at the saboteur. Now you can see the gunner is 1 space away from the saboteur. So that's already going to add sort of like 1 level of difficulty in terms of the gunner actually hitting and doing damage to the saboteur. If they were in the same space, then that wouldn't be there. So we've already got 1 sort of layer of defense in the way. Now we're going to take a look at the saboteur counter itself. That's 6. They have a built-in sort of defense of 6. So 6 plus the 1 is 7, and now they are in a defensible kind of terrain spot, which you can see in the little black shield at the bottom there. So that adds an additional 1. So the gunner would need an 8, 6 plus 1 plus 1, to actually get a hit on the saboteur. Now here you can see the gunner gets 2 options. They can do a suppress, which will allow them to roll 4 dice, or they can do an attack, which will allow them to roll 2 dice. Now suppression works the same way as the original. You don't really do any damage to a counter. You'll just flip that counter over, they'll be suppressed, and then a card will have to be played to activate and reflip that counter before you can do any actions with it. But damage is very different. So in this case the machine gunner is going to roll 2 dice to attack. Again, they need an 8. Let's say they rolled a 9 and a 4. All you have to do is get 1 hit when you roll for damage, and then that will activate the damage. You don't count up the number of hits, you just need 1 success out of that pool of dice. And just like the original, you're going to go through and remove one of the saboteur cards. Initially you're going to look in your hand. If you don't have it in your hand, you'll remove one from the discard pile. If you don't have any in there, you'll remove one from your deck and reshuffle your deck. Now the difference here is once you run out of saboteur cards from your hand, discard pile, or deck, then you're going to remove the counter. But in this game, the counter's gone forever. You can't re-recruit it and re-buy and re-recruit a new card to sort of get that counter back onto the board, because the counters themselves don't represent a squad of that type of unit. It represents a single individual. So if you didn't spend enough time early in the match, possibly, getting more of those cards into your deck from your recruitment piles, then it's very easily possible that you can lose a counter unit in this game very, very quickly if you've got nothing to sort of shore up the defense. And in some of the scenarios, you only start with 1 copy of the card, and some you start with 2, so you've got a little bit more of a buffer. So that's kind of the main differences, the main gist of it. Let's go into my 3 pillars of review at this time. I would say, player count, obviously 2 players. play time, you're looking at about a half an hour scenario. It's not really going to go much longer than that. Now, I've played Undaunted Normandy a few times, played this a few times now, so I'm familiar with the game. So I would say maybe if you're learning the game, it might go a little longer than 30 minutes, maybe up to an hour on some of the longer scenarios. But I think once folks get the hang of it, this is a good 30, 45 minute session. Now, in terms of my comparisons to what it's like, so I'm just going to directly, obviously, compare it to the original game. And there are probably, I'm not going to actually count, but there's probably 8 things I like about this better, and one thing I'm not sure I like better than the original. I think I might actually like the original for this thing that I'll leave towards the end. But let's quickly cover the stuff that I like better. I like the addition of vehicles. I like I said, the new scenarios and kind of how they roll those out and deal those out to the players and sort of progressively introduce you to some of the different tactics and scenarios and strategies and things like that. I think that's much more satisfying. I think if I did have a little bit of a critique about that in the original, it does kind of like roll it out a little bit too slow, but I don't know, I can also argue the other side of that pretty easily to say like, well, maybe this is a good like casual game, or you can get your kids into it or something like that if they wanted to play a World War II game. And, you know, so maybe it's a better idea to roll it out a little slower. So I'm not the publisher, I'm just a reviewer. So I would bet that for me, it rolled out a little bit too slow, but it was probably a smarter decision to roll them out slower in the original. I think the asymmetry here is much more pronounced. Like, for example, one side has tanks, the other side absolutely does not. One side has the strafing recon aircraft. One side has more kind of anti-tank, anti-vehicle, anti-structure cards. And so that's pretty cool. I like how that asymmetry is like leaned into more, it's built into more. And that, again, sort of goes back hand in hand with how the scenarios are rolled out. And it's just, for me, a much more interesting gameplay as far as all of that is concerned. Now, the one part which I'm not super sure about, honestly, and I almost lean to on the side of I like that I could have both options, is the whole way damage works. Because in the original, when you took damage and you lost cards from your deck, as long as you didn't run out of all the cards in your general supply, you could still get that counter back and still get it into the action. Whereas this one, you could lose that counter very quickly, and then that counter becomes worthless, you know, completely worthless. And it can be a little quick, which that on itself, on the surface, is not really the problem, because then you can take steps at the beginning of the game to recruit and get those and sort of beef up the supplies of that. But it's, you know, I haven't played every scenario in here, but I feel like that is always the smart play, possibly. It might always be the smart play to have each side sort of take turns, you know, recruiting and getting new cards in. And then once they kind of suck in all those cards, then you can start to sort of make progress and sort of, you know, entrench yourself on the front lines with that counter, because you know you're safe, because you've got extra cards in there and you're not going to lose it. Whereas if you rushed out with a counter and you've only got 1 copy or maybe 2 copies of that card, then they're much more likely to, you know, get removed from the game, and then you've lost maybe a critical position or a defensive, you know, position or something like that. So it could be that the smart play is always to do the recruitment, but I have seen that actually not be the case, because you don't necessarily want to let somebody else rush out there and take control of the objective, and now they're like a third or halfway to their victory. So there is a good sort of tension with that. But I don't know, because you still had that kind of tension in the original game, because there really still is, in both games, a balancing act between using your card actions, specifically your commander actions, to either draw new cards, to be able to activate units multiple times, and then, you know, rush and try to do, you know, the purpose of the scenario, you know, move your troops forward, attack your opponent, capture objectives. Do that, as well as maybe the more deliberative defensive type of maneuvers is, again, to recruit, you know, refresh a unit and that kind of thing. So there's a balancing act between rushing forward, you know, sort of organizing your supply lines and your morale and all that kind of stuff abstractly with the deck building. So that balancing act is still there. I just feel like it's probably a little bit more pronounced in the original, because you can go and like re-recruit a unit that has sort of been killed or been decimated, because those units represented a squad, not an actual individual. But I don't know. I like having the option of having both styles of gameplay. And it's actually going to be interesting to me to see what that kind of third edition is in terms of what it's going to sort of inject into either edition of the game. Because I assume it's going to add vehicles to the original game. Maybe it'll add some of the more squad, based gameplay where you are able to refresh units to this one or something. I don't know. So to me, it's very, very tricky if somebody would say, well, which one would you recommend? I think I would lean North Africa because it has the vehicles, the asymmetry is better, the scenario rollout, the scenarios just in general are better. But I do kind of miss a little bit of that sort of mid-game deck building aspect, which I think has kind of gone here. And it seems a little bit sort of front-loaded in terms of when you should do the deck building part. But again, I'm being sort of wishy-washy about it because it is a little bit scenario dependent and sort of tactics and sort of kind of the state of the board dependent on terms of whether or not that's actually a good idea. So this is definitely something I want to explore more, and in that regard. But it's just a little caveat I thought I would throw out there. But other than that, I definitely recommend it. It really fits in right into that Combat Commander wheelhouse for me. Now I prefer Combat Commander, but it's really trying to do a different thing. This is a lot more accessible, quicker playing, easier to set up, easier to teach, all that stuff. So it's definitely like a lighter version of Combat Commander, and it knocks it out of the park as far as that's concerned. But Combat Commander is my kind of preferred game because of just the depth and the crunchiness and the sort of the cinematics of it. But I think if you get into this game and like this game, not to review another game in this review, this is a great stepping stone to a game like Combat Commander, and which is a game I absolutely adore. But this is one, honestly, that it's going to get played probably more often than Combat Commander for me. I would probably bet $100 on that it would get played a lot more and still be really satisfying in a lot of different ways. It's going to satisfy me in a completely different way. So I definitely recommend, if you're looking for like a good light-ish skirmish World War II style game that does have some good rewards in terms of the feedback that it's going to give you and the strategies and all the payoffs that you're going to get out of it. I definitely recommend this Undaunted North Africa. Maybe slightly above Undaunted Normandy, but it's also probably good to have both styles of gameplay in the catalog. But I'll be very interested again to see what the third one offers up. So anyway, thank you.